All right, welcome back, everybody. I'd like to get us started with our final panel of the day. It's been well sort of foreshadowed as we've proceeded. Our panel really jumps off from the divergent views in the PJM region on carbon pricing and the PJM's assessment of what to do about how to manage a carbon price in some and not all of its region. PJM released and then released a second version of a paper, I think in late August, entitled Advancing Zero Emission Objectives Through PJM Energy Markets, which provides a general outline of carbon pricing framework that could apply to the entire footprint of the PJM region. I think the way I read the white paper a little bit was, it'd be really nice if we had one carbon price, but since we're not going to have that, here's what we think we might do. It's looked at some of the concepts floated in other regions, New England, CAISO, and this panel will explore that proposal. How might a carbon price value be sort of incorporated into the market? What are the opportunities and challenges and approaches that were presented, and how far would they go towards harmonizing the RTO markets and state policies? We have a great panel. We have 5 colleagues, which will mean I'm falling off the side of the stage there, but with appreciation for the quality of the input we'll be hearing from all 5 of our colleagues. I'm going to ask Gary Helm from PJM. Gary is the lead market strategist, and he will give a short presentation, just like we did in the last panel, about the white paper and PJM's thoughts on the matter. I'm then going to ask Nicole Bouchez, did I get that right? From the New York ISO to take a look at this from the New York perspective and look at what New York is trying to do with some very similar issues and concepts. Then I'll ask Talina Matthews, Commissioner with the Kentucky Public Service Commission, to comment that's from the viewpoint of Kentucky, one of the states not with a carbon price in the region. Jennifer Chen from Sustainable FERC at NRDC to look at this and maybe what this means in terms of where the region and the states and the markets could go on these issues. And then Karen Palmer, a senior fellow at Resource for the Future. And Karen has worked for years with us on issues of the energy markets and the environmental markets and how they interact. Particularly has worked a lot with the RGGI markets as well, I know. And I think maybe comment on the complexity of what we'll hear as we get down the table to you, Karen. So with that, I want to invite Gary to come up and get us started with a short PowerPoint with the white paper and the presentation. Gary?
Thank you. You have to excuse me. I may have to peek at some of these slides, but yeah, thank you to the Nicholas Institute and the Great Plains Institute to inviting me here today. Although I think I'm going to have to change the title to PJM's thoughts on dishwashing. Thanks to Peter. You couldn't do better than a dishwasher. Really? A dishwasher? How about like a... All right. So, but Ali helped me out here. All right. So I'm actually gonna talk about rinsing the dishes before you put them into the dishwasher. Okay. So we're looking at carbon pricing, and there's a couple points that I want to make here about PJM's. It's called a proposal on carbon pricing, but it's really okay if states want to have a carbon price. And if it's not a regional system-wide approach, it's just, 1 or 2, 3, 4 states, they get together and say, yes, this is what we want to do. This is our thoughts on, okay, how could we implement something like that? So I'm not opining on, is this something we should do? Is this best for PJM? We're just trying to figure out, okay, how would this work? And so that's what we're looking at here. So again, trying to, thank you. Just the main points is just enabling dispatch the way we normally do it. So right now it's security constrained economic dispatch. We've heard it earlier today. We're talking about just dispatching things at lowest price. That's what we've been set up to do, and we do it well. It has many benefits, which I'll get into on the next slide. But what we also want to point out is that if we look at a carbon subregion, the prices in that region, if that region ends up exporting to the non-carbon region, you could increase the prices outside. So even if a state, so Commissioner Matthews from Kentucky, she may say, hey, we like to burn coal, we don't want this. They may feel the price impacts if the marginal unit is in the carbon subregion. So just to point that out as well. Third, RGGI. We have RGGI states here, Delaware and Maryland and PJM. We've had conversations with them about carbon pricing. It can work with what we're talking about. So dispatch can work. RGGI can continue to operate under its framework. The issue gets to, okay, what do you do if there's a carbon adder? Where do the revenues go, and how is that addressed? So that may be, we can talk about that a little later. So next slide, if I can. Not able to. There we go, thanks. So again, this is back to maintaining economic dispatch. And what I want to talk about too, I'll just jump to the next slide, please. Our first paper that came out talked about, and this was more theoretical, about border adjustments within a carbon region and outside of a carbon region. What do you do there if you're serving load within the carbon region? Straightforward enough, if all the generation within inside the carbon region has a carbon price, they put it in their bid, and it's reflected as such. Now, if that generator is exporting to the non-carbon region, it's at a disadvantage to the generators outside of the region, so it may not run as much. But also, depending if it's, like I mentioned earlier, it could impact prices of the non-carbon region. What I circled here is the pricing of that generation when you look at imports into the carbon region. Basically, that's what we're talking about today is, and our second paper was, okay, how will we implement a carbon adder going on those things that are imported into the carbon region? Next slide. Great. So what we wanted to do is just show a quick example, and I hope you can see all the numbers here. I don't think you can see the megawatts on the generation itself. It's kind of light. But just want to show a two-node example using RGGI as an example. And these are fictitious prices, but the prices are set by RGGI that they would just be used in this process. So in the carbon region, internal to that, it's priced in. It's priced into their bids. External, that generation bids in like they normally do, but it will have, if it's going to import, there's an additional price that will be the carbon adder. So it's actually those two prices. And so what we wanted to look at is similar to California. If you go to the next slide, please. Oh, I didn't even realize it had all this stuff. Just run through this, please. Thanks. If we were to look at what California proposed, which is a two-pass system. The first pass sets the base of what's going to be dispatched in the non-carbon region. So in this case, nuclear is being used to meet the 50 megawatts of load. In the carbon region, we have a natural gas plant that's being used to meet all of the load within there. So there's no imports, exports in that first pass. And so you see, again, if you just remember, 50 megawatts is being served in the non-carbon region by the nuclear unit. So that's your base. So we go to the second pass, if I could, please. And I don't know if this has more of those things going on as well. Wow. Did I jump? Okay, good, thank you. So in the second pass, what we do is dispatch beyond that base pass. So we don't change the base in the non-carbon region. 50 megawatts is still being served by the nuclear resource. However, that nuclear resource, since it has no carbon emissions, it's less expensive than that gas resource in the carbon region. And so 50 megawatts that's left from that nuclear unit is going to be imported into the carbon region. So that's where the change comes, and that second pass is used to deal with backfilling. That was the whole reason that California proposed that, and that you're not using a more polluting resource. You're not just shuffling resources. So the one thing you do notice out of that is the coal isn't running. You know, it's not being dispatched. Now you could foresee where if there was, you know, if nuclear was maxed out at 100 megawatts and that wasn't producing anymore, and if the natural gas was, say, you know, only 50 megawatts and you needed more load, you may end up getting that from the coal. That may end up being your marginal resource. And that at, you know, $17 would be more expensive. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about here. So, you know, that's a real high-level look at what we're looking at as far as how a carbon price would be implemented in PJM. So I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Nicole, do you want to?
Thank you. Yes. So first of all, thank you very much. It's quite unusual for me to speak to PJM stakeholders, and I know a few of you have assets or have business dealings in New York, but not all of you. So I am going to talk a little bit more generally about what's going on in New York. For a few of you, that'll be very familiar, but hopefully for the rest of you, it'll be interesting. So first of all, we have a state policy, a clean energy standard, CES policy, that is really targeting reductions of carbon emissions in the state. And some of the goals in that policy are a 50% renewable energy by 2030. Now, in addition, in order to implement that, there are RECs, renewable energy credit, as well as ZECs for zero emission credits implemented. Now, at the New York ISO, we've been looking at, we have a general integrating public policy project that's going on, our program. And it has two main parts to it. I'm going to talk about the Bridal Report second, because that's usually what people want to hear about. But I also want to give you the update in terms of what the other part of that initiative is, because I think it's very important. And it goes to looking at the market rules in New York and going to two questions. One is, do we need different market products in a world with large penetration of zero marginal costs or units, essentially? And then the other part of the question is, do we need to change existing market construct or rules? So as part of that initiative, we've been looking at doing a simulation of our market with the fundamental question of, if in today's market we had all the renewable resources we expect in 2030, what would today look like? And we actually are rerunning our day-ahead market. We have the ability to rerun our real-time market as well, and that is both commitment and day-ahead and commitment and dispatch in real time. So we are most of the way, not all the way through that, and saying, what does the world look like? Now, there's no assumptions about retirements. Whoever gets committed gets committed. There's no assumptions about any difference in transmission. This isn't predicting what 2030 looks like. It's saying, how does our market work with all these renewable resources if they were here today? That will continue into a discussion of what new products might we need, what existing products might need to be revised. An example of existing things in our market rules that we may need to look at is, for example, our incentives for following base points. Our incentives for following base points in New York are scaled to the LBMPs. Well, that works really well as long as you don't have negative LBMPs. Once you start having negative LBMPs, you lose that mechanism to incent following of base points. We may need to look at that in a world with much lower LBMPs, where LBMPs are not always indicating how critical it is for us to see units following their base points. Now, the other part of this two-pronged initiative is looking at a carbon adder in the state of New York. Now, to give you a little background on this, our stakeholders are the ones who actually came to us and said, we think it is very important for you to look into a carbon adder and what adding a carbon charge would do in the New York markets. And so we commissioned the Bridal Group at that, upon that request to look into that. That report is available. It's available on our website. It tends to be referred to as the Bridal Report. You've probably heard of it as such. And it looks at the impact of adding a carbon adder to the New York markets over and above existing state policy. So it doesn't assume any changes in RGGI, any changes even in the REC and ZEC programs. And it says, is there benefit to adding a carbon charge over and above that? And they find that, yes, there are some benefits. Most notably, there's an additional 2.6 million tons of carbon dioxide per year are not emitted. To give you a feel for what that means for New York, that's about 8% of the current carbon emissions per year. Now, we all know carbon, and we've talked about it today, adding a charge will increase prices. So to give you an idea, it's part of the report. It also looks at different asset types and what kind of changes in revenue they could expect to see. And this analysis is done for 2025. It assumes approximately a $40 per megawatt carbon charge, and if alongside a $17 RGGI charge, so that's the 47 that we're all sort of very comfortable with as the shorthand that's used in a lot of studies. The analysis, though, goes beyond just saying, okay, prices would go up. To give you a feel, a combined cycle would expect to have between 21 and 31, I think, dollars per kilowatt year of additional revenue. And, but the question was, how does that impact our customers in New York? So what would the bill impact be on a customer bill? And that's where this report is really going into uncharted territory as far as we can tell. And what they find is that although prices go up, about half of that effect on consumers is attenuated by the fact that the design that they're evaluating is one where there's a carbon adder, but we return the money collected from that to customers to mitigate the impact on bills. So about half the money is returned directly to consumers through refunding the carbon charges to consumers. Another 18% is the effect on the existing REC and ZEC program bill, the way to think about it. The current program is in effect. The consumers are going to pay for RECs and ZECs, but as prices go up, the amount they have to pay comes down. And then the final 23% or so of the impact is actually dynamic effects on investment. And we all know that prices are incredibly good at getting the right investment in the right location and the right actions in the right location. And the efficiency of that is such that the overall impact is negligible, as reported in the study, on the bills. They find an impact on customer bills between a reduction of 0.15 cents per kilowatt hour and an increase of 0.46 cents per kilowatt hour. That, to give you a percentage of consumer bills, is a decrease of 1% or an increase of 2% on existing customer bills. So this has been a fascinating dialogue with our stakeholders. We are now at a point of where do we go from here? We are working with the state in tandem because we do recognize that implementing and this proposal is really to harmonize our state policy and our wholesale markets. And we won't go anywhere without having the state support on this, because it is essentially saying to the state, is there a way that we can implement your public policy in a way that is both market friendly and efficient? We are working with the state. We are going to be kicking off a process to determine a schedule of how we're going to. So this isn't going to happen tomorrow. It's probably, it's definitely, if it happens in the next 3 to 5 years, I think we're doing good. But we are about to start a process of really working through the different issues and alternate proposals as well. Are there other mechanisms that should be looked at to look at this? So that's the update. I think I'll hand it off.
Thank you, Nicole. Now, Talina Matthews.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak in front of a group of friends. This is I tried to count, I don't know if this is the 3rd different role that I've been at these meetings or the 4th. For those of you who are counting business cards, I'm now a commissioner with the Kentucky Commission. I've been here as an economist in the energy office. I've been here as a staffer at the PSC, and I think I might have been here as executive director of the PSC as well. I'm not real sure. If I serve out my term, it will be the longest that I've been in one office with one set of business cards in my career. And I will say that most of those decisions to move have been my own, not all. So again, thank you. I always enjoy these. It's a little different for me up here today. I know the folks back at the office would like me to say that I speak only for myself and not for the Kentucky Public Service Commission. Let's get that out of the way. I've jokingly said today several times, where you stand on this issue depends on where you sit. And where I sit is in a state that is still fully regulated. We produce coal. We produce some natural gas. We don't have a carbon goal, an RPS, an EES, a CEES, or other acronyms. We do have a large manufacturing base and a governor who has said he wants to expand that manufacturing base and become a manufacturing hub. The thing about large manufacturing and chemical plants is they really like big base load power. We don't lean on the wholesale market in the same way that some of the other states that are in the PJM footprint do, because we are fully regulated. Again, we have control of ensuring that our utilities have sufficient reserves to meet their load plus some reasonable reserve margin, and in return for that, we allow them to recover the costs. Some of those costs are recovered over 30 years, so decisions that were made 10 years ago to invest in a plant will be paid for by those customers for another 20 years or more. So we worry about things like stranded investments, because those ratepayers they're part of the other part of that regulatory compact. They did agree to pay for those assets. I think Chairman Hawk this morning said Ohio PUCO was no longer in the generation business. Well, we are. And we have 3 utilities that participate in PJM, and they participate in different ways. We have 2 utilities that have remained FRR. They meet their own load requirements. And then we have another utility that participates in the capacity market and participates probably more fully in the energy market than the other 2. And I want to talk about kind of the decision making that went on within the PSC when that utility asked to join PJM. This utility found itself short on capacity in the winter and had some difficulties in building generation at the time. And they were long in the summer. They're a winter peaking utility that uses a lot of electricity for home heating. So they came in, proposed to join PJM. The PSC has the ability to approve or not approve that functional control change. And the concerns at the time were twofold. One was the PSC giving up any jurisdiction over retail rates and service? And there were some conditions that were placed upon their entry into that market that was attempting to try to preserve that jurisdiction over retail rates and service. That's not really, that's a conversation for a different day. But the other was, was this the right long-term solution for that utility, given its unique little positioning? I guess, were the benefits to joining PJM greater than the costs? One of the things that the Commission looked at was, this situation of geographic diversity within PJM, and that generation diversity and load diversity of being a summer peaking system or a summer peaking system with a winter peaking utility participating. It was sold at the time that they would be able to buy low and sell high, right? What a great opportunity. I believe, and might not get this correct, that one of their attorneys referred to it as we could sell ice water in the desert, because we were selling energy and capacity in the summer when we were long and buying in the winter when we were short. Because of low gas prices and relatively low demand and the impact on the PJM markets, I think what we've seen is that utilities actually they've benefited in ways that were above what we anticipated when we looked at the benefits and costs. So when I'm talking about this carbon pricing proposal, I would love to geek out and be the economist and talk about, oh, this market construct is better than that one and this one and that one, but I can't. I have to look at it from the decision of, looking at that utility and how it's participating, looking at the other two utilities and how they participate, looking at the other entities that are within the Commonwealth that may participate into the PJM market when they have excess capacity. Great other, Kentucky loves to say that it's different. Are we Midwest? Are we Southern? Are we, But mine is, are we PJM? Are we MISO? Are we TVA? Are we large and unaffiliated in the middle? But one thing we are is heavily coal-fired generation. So again, where you stand on this issue depends on where you sit, and that's where I sit. This proposal, as you showed in your example, whether it's a system-wide carbon price, which I think would require all states in the footprint to agree. That's not likely to happen. That would have a price impact on resources situated similarly to the resources in Kentucky. But even if you carve out and put up a wall and say, these units in this area are going to have a carbon price and these aren't, you showed that that can have price impacts that go into the non-carbon region, which is really the carbon region. It's it's the region that has the carbon, and it also impacts that dispatch of that coal unit. Is it dispatching at 0? Is it dispatching at 50%? Is it dispatching at 100? Again, when we made that decision, we assumed that those utilities would be able to participate in the market fully and not be at a disadvantage. And I think this would put them at a disadvantage. We are, again, somewhat insulated because we do have IRP control. We can, require that our utilities have sufficient generation. But I think there's an impact on the market because it was not just a decision by the Kentucky Public Service Commission to allow this utility to join PJM, but it was a decision by PJM to allow this utility to join PJM, right? There were some benefits to having their megawatt hours selling into that market, whether it be this week when it was unnaturally warm in September or in the middle of the summer. And I think I'd be interested in, issues like what is that impact on reliability of that section of the system, that it's not just Kentucky that's coal-fired. That whole PJM West tends to be more heavily coal-fueled and natural gas, because let's not forget, it's not just coal that's impacted by this, it's also natural gas. How does that impact the reliability of the whole system? And then I have another question, which is completely different, and I saw a Twitter war. Is it resiliency or resilience, or both? What is the impact on, if you remove more big base load units? And what is the, how is this consistent with other proposals that, you've put forth 3 white papers, you put them forth together, but if you're talking about valuing resilience and about valuing reliability and certain attributes, how does the carbon pricing add on to that, and does that not take away from some of those efforts? And what other, Kentucky legislature has in several statutes a state policy that says we want to mine more coal. So you're not taking that state policy into account, you're taking other state policies into account, and isn't that somewhat picking and choosing winners? And is that the role of a wholesale market, to pick and choose winners? So that's mine.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to keep moving us down the table to Jennifer, and but you've already just seeded a couple of questions that we're going to come back to, Talina, so they're written down.
Resiliency versus resilience.
That's the only one.
We're going to take a poll.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? In the back? Okay, good, great. Thank you to the Great Plains Institute and the Nicholas Institute for organizing this really great panel and the conference today, and to PJM for putting forth the possibility and outlining a proposal that could enable states individually or together to price carbon and put together, propose a mechanism for addressing leakage. And certainly, Talina, we hear your concerns, and that's the, it's not something that's set in stone, certainly. Exploring ways to ensure that leakage is contained is something that is still in motion. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the opportunities and challenges to implementing carbon pricing. And because the idea is still new, and PJM in the states and the environmental advocates are still thinking about how it might be worked out and the various details, I might throw out some questions that are at the top of our minds. Obviously, there are a lot more questions than that. The Bridal Report that NISO issued certainly could also help inform what kind of questions we should be asking. So to start, I have, I guess I've listed out a few benefits or opportunities and a few challenges, and I'm noticing that I have 2 potential benefits listed out so far and 4 challenges. That doesn't mean that the benefits outweigh or that the challenges outweigh the benefits, because the first one is a big deal. By pricing carbon, you are internalizing a serious pollutant that most of the rest of the world has sought to address, and that we haven't started to address in most of the PJM states. So it's something that's important to consider. And so that alone makes this proposal very much worth seriously considering. Another benefit is that, and sorry, just to continue that thought a little bit more, in doing so, you're improving the price signals to, by pricing in carbon, you're making more efficient the price signals, both on a geographic and a temporal level. There are potential improvements to that, but we can, that certain proposers in ISO New England have proposed, but we can stick with the PJM proposal for now. Second, in addition to reducing carbon, or potentially reducing carbon, you also improve the economics of reducing other pollutants. So pricing carbon doesn't, it only takes carbon into account. It doesn't look at other types of emissions, effluents, and waste products that are also still negative externalities. But when you price carbon into the energy markets, it helps the economics of reducing these other pollutants. So that could help potentially new renewable resources or flexible demand-side resources, those types of investments. Carbon pricing alone wouldn't necessarily do the job, so I'll tell you in a second why we should still consider carbon pricing as one of the many tools available in addition to the state public policies, such as renewable portfolio standards or energy efficiency portfolio standards. Some of the caveats that I would like to discuss, or the challenges, I broke it down 4 ways. So when we talk about pricing carbon in the energy markets in the states that are willing to adopt them, we're talking about pricing one pollutant in one market, in one sector, and hopefully in at least one state, hopefully more than that. So a few caveats fall out of that. By pricing only carbon, we mentioned, you're not taking into account other types of pollutants. So this point connects with the previous panel that we talked about achieving or looking into the future, and we talked about renewables and other sorts of demand-side resources. Pricing carbon alone may not take care of all of these other state public policies. These state public policies that the CCPP-STF may seek to mitigate are very important, and so we have to keep that in mind. Second, by pricing carbon in certain regions within PJM, we have to make sure that we address the leakage problem appropriately, because if we don't, you can actually end up increasing emissions and increasing costs. So leakage is a very important thing. Third, by only pricing carbon in the electricity sector, we're not pricing carbon in, for example, the transportation sector or the heating sectors. So there is a possibility of leakage into other sectors, essentially. So one thing that we're looking to into the future is beneficial electrification. So when we have a lot of renewables on the system, we would love to see some of that energy being used in electric vehicles or grid-enabled water heaters that are electric. So that type of beneficial electrification might be delayed if we only price the carbon in the electricity sector, and if the prices go up significantly in the electricity sector. Fourth, by only pricing carbon in the energy market and not necessarily in other markets, we don't necessarily get to all of the resources. So for example, there isn't very much demand response in the energy markets. Energy efficiency isn't allowed to participate in the energy markets as a supply side resource. So these resources, although carbon-free, don't necessarily have the ability to access those carbon revenues in the energy market. So four caveats there. There might be more, but I don't want to run out the clock with that. I do also have some questions that I would love to know, and certainly we can discuss more, if folks want to later on. But two questions that are top of mind for me are, what are the cost increases from a carbon pricing regime that, as proposed? So we know that the clearing prices will go up, and we know that some of the increase in the clearing price will go to the carbon revenues due to the carbon adder. But the rest of the increased revenues go to generators, simply just because the clearing prices go up. In Nicole's example, is about half and half, so it's not insignificant. I don't have a better estimate for you sitting right here. So the question is, how do we cost effectively incent carbon dioxide reductions while ensuring that the compensation to generators is fair and that what consumers are paying for is also fair, that there isn't a windfall to generators? How much would, a carbon price is something that states would have to agree to, and if you're a state and you're looking to incent things like energy efficiency programs for low income, could you potentially negotiate with some of your generators to see if they'd be willing to help support such programs if you put that in place, understanding that they might be able to use some of those revenues. So how can we use some of those revenues in a way that will further achieve carbon reductions? My second big bucket of questions is, which resources exactly will benefit? So we have transmission constraints in PJM, like many other different regions. So if we price carbon in the energy market, does that mean that we're going to get more renewables online? Or does that mean we'll see more lower intensity resources like gas replace coal, for example? I mean, are these transmission constraints going to hold up new renewable investments or increase renewable deployment? And as mentioned before, if the carbon pricing only applies to the energy markets, how do we provide revenue streams from carbon pricing to demand-side resources like demand response and energy efficiency? Also very important resources that can be carbon-free. So just to quickly wrap up on that, we think, and maybe many of us think, I shouldn't say exactly who we are, but certain environmental groups think that carbon pricing is important. It should be done, but it has to be done right. So when you are working with your generators and thinking about what you want to do going forward, dig deep in asking questions, negotiate hard to make sure that you're getting a lot of pollution reductions and public benefit bang for your buck. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Karen, can I just pass this right to you?
Thanks. So first, thanks to the Nicholas Institute in Great Plains for inviting me here. And it's a great panel. And thanks to PJM for their proposal. The topic of incorporating environmental costs into electricity supply is something that I actually started working on over 25 years ago, but the context was a little different. Those of you who are around then, that was prior to restructuring, and it was more within the context of integrated resource planning, and the discussion was about environmental adders, and very little discussion really around carbon, but more about the other types of pollutants like Jen was talking about. So today we're moving from this traditional regulatory investment planning realm to the market realm, and things are indeed a lot more complicated than they were back in the day. Nonetheless, there are a lot of lessons from prior experience. I'm not going to go into those to a great extent here, but I do want to commend to you an RFF report that's coming out later in October that sort of does a bit of crosswalking there and talks about the lessons. But overall, as an economist, so I get to play the economist here today that Talina didn't get to, and Nicole, and there are other economists up here too, but I'm excited about the idea of incorporating these costs as externalities and real costs into the market. And I guess my comments fall into three buckets. One is a little bit more about why and spilling over into how in a more detailed sense. Also talk about options for treatment of the additional carbon revenues that are going to be associated with the way I envision this unfolding, as well as interactions with the RGGI program, which are, I think, important to understand and yet to be figured out, really. So since somebody said earlier this panel is the Achieve panel, I want to talk a little bit about the objective here. If the objective is to make the market a more important driver of clean energy and emission, more important and robust driver of clean energy and emissions reductions within PJM markets by bringing carbon costs explicitly into the market, the extent to which that's going to happen is going to depend upon the level of carbon prices, very importantly. And Gary talked a lot about the fact that, well, the existing mechanism within PJM that is pricing carbon are the RGGI markets, and the RGGI markets are very important. But I would posit that simply imposing RGGI prices on imports, as they're suggesting and doing those types of adjustments, is probably not going to be sufficient to realize the other aspirations of the state policies that are out there. So, you know, currently RGGI does exist in those regions, and it coexists with these other policies, RECs and ZECs, and none of them have zero prices that I know of. Now, there was a recent program review, and the proposals are out there, and the plan is to ratchet down the RGGI caps in meaningful ways, and so this is going to lead to some robustness in prices. But nonetheless, as you look out to 2031, I think the cost containment reserve price level is just above $25, and that's pretty far from the types of prices that Nicole was talking about based on the social cost of carbon. So, so that the levels of those prices are going to matter. But it's also going to matter how the treatment of imports is actually carried out in this realm, where we're talking about RGGI being the carbon pricing regime and the other parts of PJM being folded in, or at least their imports being treated in a way where they're covered by a carbon charge. So there's two possible approaches that I identify here. One is basically a situation where there's no change in the RGGI cap to deal with imports, but entities that import power into RGGI are actually required to surrender allowances. So that's sort of like the California model, which also covers both domestically produced product power and imports. So if the cap is not increased to cover, but those imports are required to surrender allowances, then there's going to be upward pressure on the prices of RGGI allowances and on the locational marginal prices in the RGGI part of the PJM region. And that's going to serve to strengthen the role of the market in providing these incentives for clean energy and emissions reductions, and probably impose downward pressure on the non-RGGI parts of the market, which I think is part of the intention here. But doing this would, of course, require an agreement of all the RGGI states to keep those under the cap. But an alternative approach, which would be augmenting the caps, would also require an agreement. So basically here, if the mechanism where, again, importers who sell power into RGGI are required to surrender allowances, but the RGGI states adds capacity to the caps to sort of cover those emissions in some way. Well, what is the effect going to be of that on the dynamics here? Well, it depends on how much the cap is augmented. If it's augmented in a really big way, that's going to tend to lower the allowance prices in RGGI. That could also reduce the impact of carbon prices on the LMPs in the RGGI part of PJM, and therefore not so much stronger market incentives for investment in clean energy sources. There could even be an approach where there's a sort of no augmentation of the cap at all, and you're just charging out these RGGI prices. But I think over time, that's just going to lead to the RGGI prices being lower and lower, perhaps settling at one of the two steps, the various steps that are being envisioned going forward, the bottom one being at the price floor. Okay, so but maybe a more narrow motivation here for this proposal is to limit leakage from the RGGI region outside. So it's important there to understand what kind of leakage we're talking about. I think there's leakage from RGGI, but there's also leakage from allowing imports into RGGI, and that's what the second stage dispatch in their proposal is about. But before going whole hog on this approach, I think it's important to think about that there are, or recognize at least, that there are other approaches to preventing leakage. And one such approach is using the allowance value, some portion of the allowance value created by the RGGI program within particular states as a production incentive to encourage generation within those RGGI states under the carbon cap. And this is an option that was discussed a lot within the context of Clean Power Plan proposals, but is also being considered by some of the RGGI states as they look forward to implementation going into the future. Okay, the second point that I want to address is something needs to be decided, if this is implemented, about what happens to the carbon revenue associated with power imports. And it's more complicated in this PJM setting than it would be in the NISO setting, for example, because of the multi-state nature of the problem. So the way RGGI allowances work is that states have their own set of allowances, and then when they deal with the revenues, they put them in the auction, but they are the ones who get to make decisions about how to allocate the revenues associated with those. But if there's revenues associated with sales to importers, what is going to be the approach to A, allocating those back to the states, and then B, having the states deal with them? As I suggested, one approach could be allocating to generators within to deal with leakage, but there's other things that need to be considered. I get the sense that allocating to load-serving entities is a popular approach because it tends to mitigate any price increases. But there's various options and they need to be discussed. The third bucket of issues that this raises is the idea about interaction with the way RGGI works. We talked a little bit about interaction with the price of RGGI allowances, but there's also these mechanisms known as the emission containment reserve and the cost containment reserve, which is on the high side. So what are these two elements, just for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with RGGI in the audience? So in the most recent program review, RGGI has, reflecting on the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty associated with at what prices RGGI allowances are going to clear, and oftentimes the RGGI allowances prices throughout the experience of the program have been right at the floor. So and that suggests that achieving the emission reductions that RGGI wants to do is cheaper than they expected. So how can we get both economic benefits and environmental benefits when this outcome occurs? Well, RGGI has decided to deal with that by introducing an emission containment reserve, which is a step in the supply curve of emission allowances, and it essentially sets a price step at which a certain number of allowances, basically it's $6 starting in 2021, 10% of the allowances will be withdrawn from the market if they don't sell. Two of the RGGI states, Maine and New Hampshire, aren't participating in this particular feature, but most of the states that hold title to most of the allowances are participating. So this will allow there to be, when there's outcomes in the marketplace that are lower costs than expected, there to be both environmental and economic benefits. So when we're starting to allow importers or require importers to play in this market, what are the implications going to be of that for these various features? In addition, also the cost containment reserve. I mean, would it be likely, for example, if imports were covered just by the cap as it exists, that you'd be more likely to hit the cost containment reserve, which again is a high price step at which additional allowances are introduced to the market to sort of cushion any outcomes unanticipated outcomes on the high cost side. So lastly, just thinking more broadly about the PJM market, PJM is bigger than just the part of PJM that's, RGGI is bigger than just the part of RGGI that's in PJM. And so there are going to be implications of this proposal potentially for those other states. And thinking those through, as well as thinking through, well, how they might want to treat imports into their states in a commensurate way is something that should be part of this discussion. I'll stop there.
Thank you all. I think we covered a heck of a lot of ground on that panel. I'm going to try and ask a few questions, but I actually would like to try and make as much of a conversation as I can and not sort of just directing to one person or another. But I'd like to start sort of going back to the PJM white paper and the proposal and asking a couple sort of, trying to get some basic thoughts down. You know, we heard, I think, a couple of embedded purposes of the proposal in the comments, and Karen even postulated two. Is the purpose to sort of infuse the PJM market with a drive towards cleaner energy and technology being valued in the market, or is it more just to limit the leakage out of the RGGI region and the same? And then I want to ask, you know, given what we heard from a representative from the western part of PJM, is this a proposal that can happen across the region? And to go back to the last panel, what happens if there isn't consensus amongst the membership? And if it doesn't happen, then what happens instead? And how much different is that? So I'll try and work through that a little bit. But to start with, I think part of the reason that this is coming to the fore is because you do have an apparent expansion of carbon pricing in the region, both in the stringency of the programs being proposed and in the potential geographic expansion. And so maybe the pot in the dishwasher in this instance is getting bigger. Those who missed the last panel have no idea what I'm talking about, but some of you left. But I'll start with Gary, but I'd like to actually have in terms of the two things Karen postulated, is the purpose is more to try and bring the clean energy or the low carbon, let's say, signal more across the region? Or is it more to help those who are in a carbon constrained region control for shuffling of resources and importation into the carbon capped areas?
So I'll default to that the intended purpose was to incorporate state policy into the markets. Mm-hmm. So the reasons behind that, whether they want to address leakage or whether they want reductions or whether they want jobs, would be a state decision. So for us, it's just trying to figure out ways, if a state wanted a carbon price, how we would incorporate it into the markets.
Mm-hmm. Is that the same way that, say, Jennifer, you see the purpose of the proposal?
Well, I see it a little bit more narrowly because when we say incorporate state policies into the markets, we're referring to one type of state policy, carbon reduction. And by markets, we mean one market, the energy market. So when we look at the grand scheme of things and what's going on in other parts of PJM, for example, the CCPP-SCF, if we're trying to find ways to divorce state policies outside, or if we're, I guess, okay, so just a little bit of background. The environmental groups proposed something in the CCPP-SCF to better accommodate renewable and demand-side resources in the capacity markets. And the idea is that if we're not accommodating those resources there, we're not accommodating zero emissions, zero waste resources there, and we incorporate a carbon adder into the energy markets, subtracting that component out and adding the ability to incorporate carbon into the energy markets doesn't quite undo the harm there. So that's the short answer to that. I don't know if that was very clear, sorry.
Talina, which way do you see the purposes of what white paper as you read it?
To pick certain states' policies and not others. And I have the perfect analogy on the dishwashing thing. I cook with my grandmother's old cast iron skillet, and it's fabulous. And you don't put those in the dishwasher? Just you don't.
Great.
That was good.
So in the last panel, there was a discussion on the incorporation of other attempts to incorporate state policies into the markets, that the PJM operates on a consensus and wouldn't take something to the FERC if there wasn't consensus. If the Western representatives really do not desire to have this incorporated, is this something that might still have a life in terms of being brought to the wholesale market, or is this something where you'll need to work through with all the membership a way that works for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't want to touch that one, but especially when Talina's so close.
And I have a cast iron skillet.
I should have sat there at the other edge of the, yeah.
But
And New York's in the middle. No.
I honestly, on an earlier panel on a similar subject, somebody had brought up that, well, geez, they think that PJM could take something like this to FERC, saying, hey, if you think this would make the market better, would be fair and just, result in fair and just prices, then you could take it to them. We have not adopted that. Again, this was a part of 3 papers, discussion pieces. It's exactly what's happening. We haven't made any decisions on, are we doing this? Is this the best thing for us to do? We're not there yet. We're trying to figure all this out. And so it is really good to hear other viewpoints from our states, because we do have a lot of states. And even when we're working on something like this, we realize not all states are going to like this, and how do you address something like that? That was something while we're looking at the border adjustment both ways too, because you have environmental leakage on one hand, you have economic leakage on the other hand, and what do you end up addressing? If you try to address one, you're not addressing the other, and vice versa. So for us, it's difficult, but it's not one of those things you want to ignore and just say, hopefully it goes away. So we're just trying to discuss it and see if we can come to a amenable solution.
Jennifer, you want to say something to that?
Yeah, actually I'm wondering if you do a really good job with the leakage, with the border adjustments, and for the most part, if a state decides to price in carbon, and it really mostly affects that state, so that you're not really affecting the interstate rate, the wholesale market rate. Well, okay, it's the wholesale market, but it's not quite interstate. I haven't really thought this through clearly, but does PJM have to file it in its FERC-approved tariff, or could you put these mechanisms into your business practice manuals? Like, for example, there's certain things that you put into your manuals that don't get filed at FERC, like load forecasting, for example.
So that's a good question. So if it's just a price that's getting incorporated in the bids, then we don't have to do anything. So that's easier when it's a region-wide program, system-wide. Like Reggie, we didn't have to do anything for that. The generators incorporated in their price. If we have to do a carbon adder that's additional, then that does go to FERC, and I believe California has already done that with their program.
I think the last part of this thought process for me, which I hope is helpful to others, is what is the baseline that we're comparing this against? And so, Karen, maybe I'll ask you to lead on this. If these market rules weren't brought into PJM yet, Virginia links to Reggie, Pennsylvania, dare I say even Gary builds their own carbon price. It was one thing I was floated this morning. Then how do you, and they have their own border tariff adjustments at the borders. How different does it look than what's here, but just without without PJM's endorsement? What is the baseline picture look with an expanded and intensified RGGI in the region?
Well, it would certainly complicate the two dispatch approach with, because I think there might be ordering effects depending on who you looked at first and which.
I'm sorry, what sort of effects?
Well, so, or maybe just there's, instead of 2, there's 3. I don't know. I'm not sure how that would really work in terms of informing. I guess it's just multiple combinations of things that would have to go on, and that would get pretty complex.
How about it was just RGGI and non-RGGI, but there was no two pass system, second pass system put in place? What would it look like, and what would the effect on the way things are dispatched in PJM be to have an expanded RGGI and a higher price?
I think it depends again on if they do it with a cap and how they expand the cap, and if you happen to arrive at the price you would have had before or not. It's
right.
And so I think an important part of, not that modeling tells you everything, but an important part of this process would be to do some more formal modeling to look at what would happen in that case, I think.
But I think,
Because,
I was going to say, but I think as prices for RGGI go up, leakage concerns become
certainly,
leakage becomes more of an issue and more of a concern.
Right.
and that is anticipated with the program review, having prices go up and actually adding some heft to the prices. So, on the other hand, we did do some analysis at RFF of the emission containment reserve and didn't really find a big incremental leakage effect. And we didn't look at exactly the proposal that they put forth, but it was pretty close. So at those price levels, I don't think it's too much of a concern, but down the road, it could be more of one.
You mentioned the idea of the load sorting entity having a regulatory obligation as a proposal. Would you foresee that as a possible way that RGGI would control for that leakage and try and do it in a way that provides an allocation that's keeps the price point about the same? The California style system of.
Again, if you're just keeping the RGGI caps the same and these imports are being added into it, then that's going to push the prices up. But you at least have a mechanism here for dealing with that. So, and I guess the virtue of that, one potential incentive effect of that pushing the prices up would be more incentives for clean energy that would drive down, again, as Nicole, they found in the Bridal study, the costs of these other mechanisms that are in place in some of the states.
I'll ask one more question, then we'll go to the room. I want to go back to the question I think Talina raised, which is, and I think maybe for everyone in the panel, but particularly maybe Gary and maybe Nicole, in sort of metaphorically what you're doing in New York, how do these carbon constraining policies interact with other state goals of resiliency, and how do you reliability on the grid, and is there a potential, I think, that they might run counter to the resilient or resiliency goal, and has there been some thought about how they would work together?
So from our point of view, we were just looking at carbon price implementation. So in doing this, we weren't taking into any consideration of impacts to resilience. And yes, I'm using resilience instead of resiliency. We weren't looking at any impacts there. We were just focused on the implementation. So, and again, it's all dependent on the price. If the prices rise high enough that you're actually changing dispatch, there are definitely implications to that. What they are, I don't know. I would have to default to the paper that we had released earlier on reliability and just the work we did there to look at this issue as far as Okay, if we see retirements of nuclear units, we see retirements of coal units, and we get a lot of gas on the system and renewables, what happens? And in general, we saw that we were still maintain reliability. And the nice thing about that, that's what we plan for. I mean, we're looking out 10, 15 years trying to maintain the system. And so any changes that we do see, it's not like they're happening overnight. So we're addressing those.
I think the question of the totality of state goals has been one and is going to be one that is discussed a lot in New York because, as you point out, it's not just even resiliency. There are job goals, there are industrial goals, there's a whole portfolio of goals. And the mechanism we are about to start to discuss in New York, and the one envisioned in the Bridal paper, is one wherein the state sets the adder to be consistent with goals. And part of the reason it wasn't envisioned to be a purely externality or social cost of carbon based or some exogenous outside number coming in, is that it is envisioned that different state governments may have very different sets of goals, and that setting that would have to be consistent with those goals. Now, it is a very tricky point, I think, in many ways, because at the moment everybody's focused in on carbon as the goal, and I think there are certain members of the panel who are very interested in that and potentially, and how that plays out with things like job goals, like industrial goals, economic development goals, not just resiliency, which is our industry and that we look at. So we are looking forward to having a lot of discussions on this. I think it will ultimately be critical in what the state supports and whether the state continues and ultimately endorses whatever the proposal ends up being in New York.
Can I just actually
Sure.
Dangerously reinterpret or restate some of what you said? What I want to ask is, in the balancing of the goals that you're describing there, that the policymakers in New York are going to have to do, are you still interpreting that will come down to what the carbon adder level is, so that the number will change given the, or you think there's another pricing mechanism or another way to internalize into the market some other societal goal?
So I think it's both. So it is the interaction of a carbon charge and other state policies. And at the moment,
right,
those that we have are RECs and ZECs, right? But you can envision policies that are similar to RECs and ZECs that are targeting complementary or other goals. And you also have a carbon charge that allows you to target carbon. And it's the interaction between those mechanisms that then becomes important for the state. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's going to be an and.
Okay. Before I go to the question, anybody else on the panel want to speak to this balancing the goal, this societal goals?
I would just comment, when you lay down at night, be very happy that you're the New York ISO, you're contained in one state, and that state is contained completely in that ISO, and that you can have conversations about what are my goals, what are the goals of a state, and how do they line up, because some of us don't have life that easy.
It's a very different world indeed, yeah. And it has its pluses and it occasionally has its minuses, but I think we very much appreciate that we're in a very.
What is your? Karen raised a point at the end of her. I think it was at the end of Karen's talk about how Reggie is bigger than PJM. We're there,
Reggie,
yeah. And what is your perspective on how this proposal would come back and affect you through the Reggie market, but not through the ISO market?
So the beauty of the design that Bridal looked at is that it's layered on Reggie, so it doesn't require any changes to Reggie. Mm-hmm. Now, there are leakage concerns, and there are currently leakage issues with Reggie. Now, I think at the moment, given the the clearing prices, it's not seen as being an immediate issue happening, or at least a large immediate issue. But I think it is one of the leakage that happens when you have differential pricing mechanisms across boundaries is always going to be the case. One of the interesting things is that we tend to talk about leakage because of imports a lot. The Bridal Report also talks about leakage on exports. The fact that you can distort essentially the dispatch and get to a less efficient overall dispatch, and that the mechanisms to address that are probably also appropriate to look at. And so that's also going to be on the pile of things that New York is going to have to look at as we proceed in looking at design options.
Right. Karen?
Just recognize that the mechanism that is in the white paper doesn't require any changes in RGGI, but it will imply changes in what happens in the RGGI region. And,
can you make more explicit what changes you would foresee? I mean,
well, mostly it's going to be depending upon how those imports are accommodated in the program. And if there is no change and it's just treated as a charge, then it's going to affect the clearing price in future auctions and probably drive it down, I would think. I don't know.
It sort of depends, right? I mean, at the limit, it could have no impact because essentially New York is buying all the RGGI requirements, right? And in return, other areas are.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, and so that in that case, your units wouldn't need the RGGI allowances?
Well, it'd be sort of the opposite, right? They would sort of be using the RGGI analysis and allowing others to not need RGGI allowances because the reduction had already been achieved. That's if we hit the caps, right? So if we hit the caps, because New York has got so much abatement, then potentially you could sort of undo, you're paying huge amounts for essentially nothing, ultimately. So these are definitely things that are going to be part of the discussion. There's definitely an interaction with RGGI in how you deal with leakage. And that is still going to be an open topic. There are many options for doing it, and I have no idea where we will land.
I think we were also talking about two white
Two different
papers.
things, yeah.
Because,
I was talking about berries.
I think Nicole, you were talking about the Bridal white paper, which would bring in a higher pricing regime in New York, drive abatement in New York, lessen the demand for abatement elsewhere in the region. Karen, you were talking about the PJM white paper, where we are going to actually require some sort of coverage of imports, and that necessarily will require RGGI to figure out are they allocating more to the imports coming in or not, and so it's firmly establishing the complexity and the need to talk. But before we run out of time, let me get to the audience. Franz has the microphone. I stole the other one, so Franz, you're going to have to be really nimble and reach all of our
Hi, Samantha Williams, Natural Resources Defense Council. Another one of us is in the room here. This is a question for Nicole.
Sure.
Talking about the Bridal paper, I think as you called it, were there any results from that analysis of what kind of revenue would be available to New York as a result of a carbon adder?
It is not seen as a revenue generation. The mechanism it anticipates is that the revenue collected essentially would immediately be turned around back to consumers, and so it would go to offsetting the consumer impact on it, and it is approximately 50% of the revenue of the consumer price impact. So,
thank you.
Mike in the front row here. It's coming from behind you. The microphone.
Yeah, Mike Cashin, Minnesota Power Elite. I appreciated the discussion about how there might be countervailing effects of the reliability components and putting the price on carbon, in that, if you consider the dispatch curve where there's the pecking order of least cost units. Putting the price on carbon will serve to change the dispatch order on some of the units that are currently providing the reliability services that are conventional in the system. So I can see that after you've accomplished keeping nuclear units online by giving them additional revenue through a pricing structure, you're going to be running into an issue where the more price you put on carbon, the more you're going to have to apply to preserve reliability as the market forces increase intermittent resources and that type of thing. So there seems to be a crossover spot in the strategies that you might want to give consideration to. Maybe a while before you reach it, and it's going to be different for each region, but that's something we're concerned about in our area, where we know that we import about 20% of the power, and our modeling already shows that it's the cross-border imports that are carrying a significant role in preserving our local reliability. Thanks.
Anybody want to comment on Mike's comment?
I can, to some extent. So I recall earlier that you brought up things like frequency response, voltage supports, reactive power, as some of the services that are traditionally associated with baseload generation. And today, a lot of smart inverters are able to provide those types of services, or there are other types of mechanisms that you can put in place to provide those types of services. So PJM's fuel security and resilience white paper, I botched the name of that, it goes into some of that. FERC also has some, it also conducted some rulemakings, I think last year, on primary frequency response and reactive power right through and things like that, and how new inverters can provide those services. So we can look to clean generation, clean energy resources to provide those services. Another point is potentially, a lot of the nuclear and renewable energy resources are low in the supply stack. So I guess the question is, how would the carbon adder change the ordering in the supply stack? I actually just, I'm not entirely sure, but.
And I can probably speak to that for
Yeah.
New York. So New York is I think, very different position than PJM, because we essentially don't have any coal left. We have one unit that hardly ever runs. And there isn't a lot of reordering. A lot of the impact, the effect of a carbon adder is actually in investment decisions to get higher LVMPs, but it's not so much in a reordering of the stack. Most of what is on the margin in New York is natural gas and hydro, for the most part, is opportunity costs, so it's also being driven by natural gas prices and time of day. And then we have imports, so that's not a lot to reorder, essentially. Now, we do have oil units, we have dual fuel units, except that in the current conditions and prices, they are not running. So you're not, they're sitting up very expensive, waiting for, the day that either natural gas goes up or that we really have a large need. So in practice in New York, we're not expecting to see a lot of reordering. I suspect it's slightly different in PJM.
Yeah, and I mean, again, that depends on price. We haven't run any models to see what, price that would be at, but, I'd have to go back to our report on reliability and resilience, where we just assumed the changes happened, and we looked at the impacts and, what it would be to reliability and resilience. And again, we would have to see a large change in order for that to be enacted. And that is something we continually monitor, especially we are seeing growth in renewables. So, it's still a small portion of our total overall load, but you know, it is a growing part, and so we are seeing changes, and that's why we're doing a lot of the research we are, just to make sure we're prepared for that.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify, you know, with the point I made, that much of the reliability dynamics are impacted by the duration and the nature of the upset conditions that you're responding to. So, for example, use of the inverters and backup resources and supplemental generation have their place. I'm thinking more along the lines of what Mark had shared about how these attributes of reliability are important and need to receive consideration. One program this morning talked about using price signals to keep that resource available so that it could serve its reliability role. And then in this discussion, we're talking about things that would push those resources out of dispatch order, or so that they would run less, which would be aggravating the problem. So, you know, essentially if you're successful on one, you're going to be at the detriment of the other. Once you get past, you know, whatever you are attempting to do with nuclear resource, and I'm not necessarily talking about coal and gas order changing. We have different efficiencies in the gas fleet and variances, and what can be rapid response for intermittent resources. So I think it's an issue that needs some thought, and we'll be addressing it in the technical paper we'll be publishing next month. So I'd be glad to share that with you if you're interested.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and I just, again, for us, it's an important issue, but it's something that we keep close tabs on if we're getting the response we need in those situations. So I appreciate the comment.
Mike, that technical paper will be from Minnesota Power or from, great.
It'll be in natural gas and electricity journal.
Should I say that for the microphone? Sure. It'll be in the Natural Gas and Electricity Journal for those maybe online who couldn't hear Mike's answer. Franz, do you have a question? I actually like to turn back to the panel and go back to the PJM white paper and ask a question that I've already foreshadowed before our panel, which was we did have this less likely to happen than not, but proposal that Pennsylvania might actually decide that they want to price carbon on their own. And how executable would be a two-round second pass system like we're talking about there if you actually had not a carbon constrained region and or carbon price region and non-carbon price region, but actually had two separate carbon prices within the region and a non-carbon priced region?
Game over. So, yeah, that's the one thing we stress, that we need a uniform price. And so, you know, we could deal with maybe one sub-region, but two, no. It just falls apart. And even as such, I mean, doing this 1 and 2 pass optimization, it is not ideal. I mean, you are changing, you're doing that base pass and you're changing normal dispatch just doing that base pass. So you got to realize this is not a...
For those who don't, how frequently are you doing this? Because this isn't done monthly.
It's quickly. And Commissioner Place had pointed out carbon pricing being an elegant solution. Yes, on the surface, but behind the scenes, it's like making sausage. You know, it's not pretty, and so things do change. I mean, it's not the same way we operate the system now, and you lose some of those efficiencies. But you know, and that's where you have to do the cost benefit. Are you getting the benefits you want, and what's the cost to the system to do that?
Nicole, this is when you can be glad again. You have one state and one.
Yes.
So.
I am glad.
Do we have any other questions for Holly?
Exactly from Delaware. Again, this will teach you to invite an air regulator to your meeting. So I have a basic question. The proposal pricing is in the energy market and not in the capacity market. And why did you not put this in the capacity market? I presume it's more because of dynamic pricing of carbon. And if that's the case, why can't you assume a fixed price and put it in the capacity market? And could it be viewed as, I guess, and it's not a giant leap to go back and say, can it be viewed as a disincentive and therefore make the adjustment that you're trying to do vis-a-vis adjusting the price of electricity on dispatch on the rest of the states that don't price the carbon? Follow what I'm saying?
So, yeah, and I'll try to address those in the dealing with carbon, because it is, the externality is like a fuel price, and so that gets priced into the hourly offers from the generators. So we look at these environmental externalities the same way. That's the way it's done now with the RGGI, the NOx. I mean, you're familiar with that in SO2. They get priced in. So the capacity market, you're paying, for a resource, as far as megawatts 3 years from now. I'm not sure exactly how you would price carbon other than trying to select tranches of resources, which we don't want to go down that path. And so that is why we're looking at this. It's more of, okay, how much do you emit? How much does it cost to treat it? And get that into your energy price. And ultimately, you really want more of the market pricing to go through the energy market, so you can get that response you need when you need it from the different resources you get. That's where you see those attributes better, as opposed to the capacity market just looking at megawatts years from now. So I hope that answered your question. As far as being a disincentive, in what way were you posing it being a disincentive? If you could mind repeating that.
States that have a carbon price adder.
Yes.
You're talking about, you're trying to offset the incentives that that states offering, for instance, for renewables or some other attributes, to advance the policy. And for states that want to advance it's a negative incentive
yes.
to carbon generating sources. So why can't that be offset across the region in the same manner?
That is a difficult question, because when I think about, especially in PJM, it's always the way it happens, where you have competing policies even within the state, where one of the I'm thinking back to another panel where somebody brought up, well, if you're doing a carbon adder, and the goal is to reduce carbon, then get rid of all these other programs like the RPS or the REX, ZEX, and everything, and just because they're all doing slightly different policy, and they're competing with each other. One ends up favoring one resource over another, and so if there's any way to make things more uniform, that's what you want to do. In this day and age, it is really tough to do any type of policy without counteracting another. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer there.
Can I add to Gary, because I want to just...
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. To sort of second and even emphasize what the point I think you were making, which is it is so important to do things in the right market. And that it's so important that Bridal actually has a section of their white paper, a small section, but that deals exactly with that point, which is that you have to, insofar as you can, act in the right market in which you want to incent the behavior. And that there are some other proposals in other ISO regions to change capacity market rules, for example, in New England. But those are really second best proposals because they're saying, okay, we can't deal with the first best approach. How can we minimize the impact of subsidies on capacity market prices? But that there's a huge amount of value in actually acting within the market in which you want to act the behavior. And so that's just what I wanted to reinforce, because it really is a critically important thing to get the incentives right. Because if you don't do that, then you end up having to fix all the incentive problems you've created. And the fixes are often worse than the initial disease, and keeping track of all these secondary.
Karen, you wanted to add to that?
And just to add to that, I think that the changes that you making these changes in the energy markets will spill over to incentives for investment,
absolutely.
for sure. Because the clean generators will be able to earn more money by virtue of the higher clearing price.
And I think, and also to add to it, you don't just need to consider similar programs with similar goals. You also have to consider all what Mike brought up about resilience. Are you, helping or harming that? And unfortunately, we still need to define that. But these are all things we have to incorporate with policy. And I'm glad I'm not a commissioner here, but let other people do that real hard work. We just have to implement things. But ultimately, it's a challenge for us.
One more question here.
Yeah, one question to follow up on this line of discussion, because I'm following the whole distinction between pricing carbon and energy versus capacity and so forth. But I think, Karen, as much to your point as anything, I'm thinking ahead to, and maybe it won't be here, and it certainly won't be in Kentucky, Commissioner Matthews, but to the day when you've got very high penetrations of renewables. If the method, if the basis is pricing the carbon emissions from the fossil fuel, and that's really reflecting an additional revenue stream for the renewables, what happens when the fossil sort of falls off and you've got many, many more hours when you get no carbon adder because there's no carbon? How does that work? How does that really support the investment? How is that sustainable going forward?
I'd just like to say that if renewables happen, they happen.
Fair enough, Commissioner. I did not mean to
it's not that there won't be renewables in Kentucky.
Sure, sure.
Right now, they can't compete on price with coal.
So, taking that little distinction out, if we actually move ahead with a world that gets less and less carbon intensive, how far does this idea of a carbon price on carbon emissions, or price on carbon emissions, how far does it take us before we realize that it won't go any farther? And what do we need to do then?
I'm going to ask for pithy answers since we're almost at time, but from any of our panelists, actually.
For me, it comes in that we need to define what we need out of the market, not the type of units, but what are the attributes for them, and make sure we have the products to support the provision of the amount of those attributes that we need.
And I think customers would really like that scenario, right? They got low-cost electricity.
I'm gonna ask one more question, moderator's prerogative, which is, I think Jennifer brought up the fact that some ways of abating may not be able to bid into the market, and so I actually don't know the market access rules well enough in PJM to say I can speak with authority on that, but if I understood you correctly, certain energy efficiency investments, et cetera, might not be able to be in the market. Those, of course, are very good capacity. A kilowatt hour not used is one that's always available. So is there a thought to look at that side of the supply side and expand the low carbon options in the market? Is that another conversation that should be had?
So from our perspective, we're looking at that side of the market just for operationally, and because we're seeing more distributed energy resources, you know, what is our role going to be in that kind of world in the future? You know, if we're seeing more microgrids, how do we want to integrate with it? You know, how is everything, you know, how is that getting paid for? How are we surviving, you know, with our income? It's a different world, and it's a good point. But I think focusing, I like Nicole's comment about focusing on the attributes. What the attributes do we want, and creating avenues to get those. You know, we're trying to develop markets for those and to incentivize that right kind of behavior. And I think that's the focus, you know, we need to have over the next, for the future, because that's when you're trying to enact certain policies for certain goals, you gotta, I think, back up and look at the attributes. I mean, I can't emphasize enough what a good point that was.
And I'm going to have to stop us there. I'm going to steal Sarah's thing. I'm doing one more thing, Doug. So you chop off the last sentence of thank you. You have planned. 3 words. How should PJM approach the balkanization of a carbon and non-carbon component of the area? 3 words.
I'll give you 2 very cautiously.
Good luck. Leave us out.
Eliminate barriers to low carbon resources, all hyphenated at the end.
Yeah, a lot of hyphens. Yeah.
With creativity.
There you go.
Oh, nice.
All right, well, join me in thanking this wonderful panel. And I think I should just close this. I think it's been a full and long day. I said to somebody in the hallway that we were really wonky, but there was a room full of people who really, I think, are quite wonky, and I quite enjoyed it. I think we really surfaced a lot of issues, and from the Nicholas Institute, from the Great Plains Institute, we really appreciate everybody who's come to participate today. It's only by iterating with people who are making decisions and in the field and studying this that we really can help define what we work on to make sure we're working on things that are useful going forward. So thank you for so much rich conversation. And for those of you who are here, I look forward to having a beer now. And for those of you not, have a safe trip home. Cheers.